Thank you. Thank you. What a blessing to be here among fellow believers and among people that believe that the greatest days of this nation are not yet come. I want to thank Pastor Toma for putting this together year after year after year, and all the volunteers and everything that goes into putting something like this together. This is not an easy thing to put it together. Let them hear you right now, because they deserve a great amount of thanks. What I'm going to do in the time that I have today, and I'm going to warn you, I'm going to move fast, so put your seatbelts on, folks, because we're going to do in about 35 minutes what I'd normally do in about 14 weeks. So we do a version of it that's like a couple-day seminar if you'd like to see it. We've also got a book back there called God, Man, and the Constitution. That's our gift to each one of your families today. If you could, put a donation in. If 20 people put $10 in, we've got enough to pay for the next, batch that comes. But that's our gift to you today. We want you to read it and study it. And as our previous speakers just spoke, and thank God we've got people like that representing us in our legislature. At the end of the day, I want to hit the road running. I don't want to just have everybody go home and say, wow, we had some great speakers here, and it was just exciting, and then kind of like, wake up the next day and say, well, I got life happening again. We're going to hit the road, folks, after today. And so, what I'm going to do in the next little while is explain how we got here, and perhaps then at the end of the time give you some additional things that we can do in this nation and in this state to return our nation to be truly a nation under God. Now, we are in a tough place right now. And we're going to start out dark, and it's going to get lighter at the end, but we are in a tough place right now. You saw a little bit of tip of the iceberg of some of the things that are happening. Our legal division at Salt and Light Global is called the Great Lakes Justice Center. We're representing people all over the country. And I'll give you a couple praise reports along the way, but you heard of a Hobby Lobby case and you thought, wow, we've got some religious freedom now again. Well, as soon as that case came down, they tweaked the regulations, and now we're representing a company, a big company that's got hundreds of employees, and the owner's a Christian. He doesn't want to, pay for abortions. And now all of a sudden he's got a Supreme Court case that backs him up. What does the administration do? They go in and they tweak the regulations, and now he's got to pay for abortions again. This is a scorched earth policy that they're coming after Christians, folks. Now we went in, here's the praise report. We went in, the federal judge just ordered the United States government to not fine this guy millions of dollars and put him out of business, and to not make him pay for abortions. So praise report for that, for the business in Florida. We're representing a former pastor who all he did is get out on the sidewalk in the most public area and engage in the most public kind of speech protected by the First Amendment, and a local judge didn't like the political message that was in there, and so, hey, have this guy arrested with a felony, obstruction of justice, let's put him away forever. We'll shut him up. Praise report, there's always a higher court, and they have just dismissed that obstruction of justice charge. Now, case after case after case is happening like that all around the United States, and you're not even hearing about most of them. And in addition to that, we watch very carefully the Federal Register. And so when the Federal Register, those are the people that you don't elect, they're the bureaucrats, but all of a sudden they have all this rule-making power that affects your lives and affects your church and affects your business. And all of a sudden now, they've got proposed regulations that we're responding to through Judeo-Christian Worldview with some of the best lawyers in the country helping us write these things. They want to say, okay, well, some states said that we're going to stop people like Planned Parenthood and other people that kill unborn sons and daughters. We're going to stop money going to them. Well, now they've got a federal regulation that they're going to try and stop the states from doing that. So every time we attempt to stand for truth, somebody on the other side is spending a lot of money and using a lot of influence to get it changed. The State Board of Education policy that you just heard. That, the men in your little girl's bathroom is one of the smallest things actually you need to worry about that policy. If you go and read about it, it's going to restrict freedom of speech, freedom of religious conscience, take away due process that's protected under the Constitution. The good news there, folks, they're now on our turf. You've got some statewide bureaucrat you never heard of that's advancing some agenda for the state. Guess what? Now the local school boards, they're on our turf now. And so that's why we challenge you to run for office, to get involved in your school board, and to find out what kind of policies they have that are affecting the safety of your children. Now, do I think somebody that's sexually confused or feeling like a transgender is going to hurt somebody in your? No, probably not. But you know what? I was a United States prosecutor long before I was a federal judge. And I saw many, many cases where pedophiles will take advantage of every opportunity they can, including laws like this. And so if somebody tells you that your safety of your children are not at risk, you just tell them they don't know what they're talking about. How did we get here, though? How did we get to a place where good seems to be now bad and bad seems to be good? The Bible talks about that. How did we get here, though? Well, we only have so much time, but I'm going to give you an anchor verse to start with. Genesis 1:1. You don't even have to have your Bible because we all know it. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. And when he was there, what did he do? He created this amazing thing we call creation, and he saw the stars in the sky and the moon and the trees and the animals. And after each time that he created, what did he say? He saw it and it was good. And then he created man and woman, long before the Supreme Court decided, we can maybe, blur that idea. But he created man and woman, and then what did he say? He saw it was very good. Well, when the God of our creation, the Almighty Creator, does something good and very good, it's not going to take very long before the devil takes notice. So skip to Genesis 3:1, chapter 3, verse 1. And now you begin to see the devil getting involved and coming to Eve. Did God really say? God had set the standard. He created this wonderful, amazing creation and had set the standard and gave them all kinds of freedom and said, do whatever you want, but just don't eat from this one tree. One tree. Now, the devil's a clever little thing that we should never underestimate. Did God really say? What was the question that was really being asked there? What was the question underneath the question? Yeah, do you trust God? Will you follow his rules? God had given them a lens through which to see the world, didn't he? A lens that they would be safe if they would follow what he asked them to do. And the devil said, let me exchange the truth for a lie here for a minute and give you an opportunity to put a different kind of lens on. How would you like to be God? Why don't you get to make up the standard? Isn't it all about you and your personal autonomy and your personal identity? Shouldn't it be all about you? Can't you make up the standard just as good as God? Did God really say, will you surely die? Well, because of time, I'm going to skip forward a few years up to 1776. And our founders had a choice which lens through which they were going to form our country. And they chose God's. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Why do you think they're self-evident? Well, where does God say he puts the law? He puts it right on our hearts. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal, endowed by their Creator, capital C, by the way, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life and liberty. Now, unalienable, that's a fancy legal term that kind of means that was there at the beginning of time. It's going to be there at the end of the time. It's a standard. It's unchangeable. It can't be taken away from you. Not by government, not by anybody. It's there at the beginning of time, and it'll be there until God comes back. And then the promise of that declaration we found in the way they formed our government. And they gave us, and they, being we the people, gave us a constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union. Folks, when you hear somebody talking about separation of church and state, and then they go to the Bible and they say, well, even Jesus said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and isn't Caesar government? And unto God what is God's? Well, yeah, it is. But be a good apologist. Be able to give a defense for the hope that you have. What does the Bible really say about that? Well, yeah, Caesar was government. But who was Caesar? Was Caesar a democratic republic? Was Caesar we the people in order to form a more perfect union? No, Caesar says, I'm the law. Caesar says, I'm the law. And so when someone says separation of church and state means render unto Caesar what is Caesar and God's what is God's, and that means we shouldn't be involved in government, that's exactly the opposite of what the Bible teaches. If government is Caesar today, who's the Caesar? We, the people. We in this room. So we have an obligation to stand for truth. But I digress. When the founders put this Constitution together, when we, the people, in order to form this more perfect union, put this Constitution together, we understood that all have sinned and fallen short. And that's why we separate power. We don't give all the power in one place in our nation to any one person or any one branch of government. Why? Because, all have sinned and fallen short. We also know that absolute power corrupts, therefore, and absolute power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And our founders understood that. And I love the fact that they were citing Isaiah earlier. Yes, our founders, we have to be truthful. They read secular thinkers and Enlightenment thinkers, and Montesquieu did talk about separation of powers, but you know what? They read a lot more. They read the Holy Bible a whole lot more, and they understood, Isaiah, the king, the judge, and the lawmaker. And they understood that all have sinned and fallen short, and they understood, therefore, that we must separate power because power will corrupt, and absolute power will corrupt absolutely. How many were here a year ago? Remember my rattle story? Should I tell it again? Our founders understood that when we were babies, we weren't born good. And if you ask a classroom these days, are you born good or bad? Most people in the classroom are going to say we're born good. 15 years ago, when I asked the question, almost everybody said they're born bad. And then I'll usually find in the room somebody who's sheepishly not raising their hand, and I'll go over. It's usually, a young woman who turns out to be a mother. and I'll say, you didn't think we were all born good. How come? And she says, because I have children. So, our founders understood that if you give, let's pretend this microphone is a rattle. If you give this rattle to a baby, and you let the rattle be played with, baby plays with the rattle, and now you have a second baby coming in to want to partake in the rattle playing. Does the first baby crawl over and say, here, I would like to share this rattle with you because we were all born good? No, in actuality, what would probably happen is the first baby would pull the rattle to her chest and say, no, it's mine. Well, folks, power is fairly similar to that rattle. And when these babies grow up, some of the folks that exercise power in our nation work in this building here, and some work in this building here, and some of the babies that grow up work in that building down there. And our founders understood the fundamental sinful nature of man. And so they created a constitution and a form of government that would require those holding power to follow the rule of law. And today I've brought along a power cord to represent the exercise of government power. And if you notice, again, I have a little bit of red tape at the end of the power cord because when government exercises power, it tends to make a lot of red tape. Well, what our founders did is they said, if we are going to allow anybody in this building here or anybody in that branch of government over there or anybody in Congress down there to exercise power, we're going to require that they have a power source, and it's going to be the rule of law. And the rule of law for our nation is what? The American Constitution. And so when somebody in the executive branch acts, for example, proposing a policy that says you have to give funding to people that kill unborn baby sons and daughters, the first question that you should ask is, where was your power source in the Constitution? Because you cannot if you are going to utilize power and I was going to try and turn a light on with this thing, I would have to plug it into a source, wouldn't I? And if I didn't do it, there would be no power there. And similarly, Congress or the president or the executive branch, if they're going to exercise power and make regulations like that govern your lives, the very first question is, where was your power source? Because if the Constitution doesn't provide them with a power source, they are acting outside their constitutional authority. The next question that we need to ask is, not only did you use a proper power source, even if you did you somehow violate one of our fundamental unalienable freedoms, like the freedom of speech and the freedom of religious conscience? Because if they did, even if they had a legitimate power source, then the next question is, did you nonetheless violate freedom of speech or the free exercise of religious conscience? And so I always use the example of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, now known affectionately by both sides, had to have a legitimate power source. And so what happened is eventually the Supreme Court said, hey, you had a legitimate power source. The government has the power to tax, and this is the largest tax that's ever been imposed on the American public, but that doesn't matter, because as long as Congress has the authority to exercise their power in this way, then the act should be constitutional. Okay, we've got the Affordable Care Act. The next question then is, well, what if somebody then takes that act and creates regulations and laws in America that says, as a Christian organization, you must pay for the killing of an unborn son or daughter if that employee wants to kill their unborn son or daughter? Well, if you're a Christian, what are you going to do? We go to the First Amendment immediately. We don't even have to be a constitutional scholar or a lawyer to know, hey, the First Amendment says that government can't use its power to interfere with my religious conscience. They can't establish a religious government, and they certainly cannot interfere with my free exercise of religious conscience. Well, then how come it seems like every time we turn around, that is happening? How did we get here? I can tell you that at one time in our nation, if somebody in the government tried to use its power to interfere with your religious conscience, let me show you what would happen. The Supreme Court would go to a very special shelf they have, and they would pull down a very special microscope. And they would take this Supreme Court microscope, and then they would take this exercise of government power that was interfering with your religious conscience or your religious speech or your due process, any of these fundamental unalienable rights, and they would put it under the microscope. And they would look at it so closely and give it such a high level of scrutiny that virtually every exercise of power by the government that would interfere with your freedom of religious conscience or your freedom of speech would be struck down and held unconstitutional. Let me tell you what has happened very recently, and one of the things that we at the Great Lakes Justice Center are responding to. The United States government has now taken the official position, and you can read it in the United States Commission on Civil Rights report to the President and Vice President and President of the Senate and to the Speaker of the House. Read their report. Their official position now is that religious conscience interferes with other rights that the court has created out of thin air. And because religious conscience interferes with these other rights that have been created out of thin air, religious conscience needs to go. We are facing some serious times. Part of the reason that I left full-time employment and we got ourselves debt-free, and I come around doing what we're doing here, is I read a Supreme Court decision, the same-sex marriage decision, Obergefell, and I read that decision and I realized that has nothing to do with same-sex marriage, or very little to do with same-sex marriage. It has everything to do, not reported by the press, but it has everything to do with how we're going to change the way we govern our nation and how we are going to use unelected, not anybody that ever has to face an election, people to socially transform our nation and allow them to do that without ever having to face an election. How do we get there? Well, government under our original system, where government had power and could exercise power, one of the things that government could properly should exercise power in is maintaining safety and maintaining order. And the Bible says, for example, that we should be aware of government, because government's proper role is to condone that which is good and punish that which is evil. And that is one of the reasons we are under government authority, under God's Word. And our founders understood that, and for a couple hundred years, that's the way it worked. Government could use their power to regulate unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct. Now write this down in your mind or on your piece of paper. Government traditionally had always been allowed to, through a biblical world lens, to regulate unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct. That's why it's against the law to murder. They could even regulate unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral sexual conduct. That's why it's against the law to rape or have, or even statutory rape. Well, under that approach, a partial birth abortion would have been considered unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct. So would the killing of a preborn son or daughter by abortion. And the states and the people in those states, through their representatives like the ones you saw up here, in the vast majority of the states, almost all 50 states, had that discussion, and their state legislature, responding to the people and after debate, passed laws that protected unborn sons and daughters in the womb. Well, if you want to engage in unhealthy, dangerous, or immoral conduct, like an abortion or a partial abortion, and the government is using its power to stop you from doing that, what do? Well, you could go to the legislature and change the law, but guess what? They tried to do that and they didn't have the votes because they could not get the support for that. So what did they do instead? They went and found 5 lawyers wearing robes that work in this building up here and said, what can you do about this? Why don't you recharacterize that unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct, and let's call it something else. Let's call it liberty. In fact, let's create a new constitutional liberty of personal autonomy and personal identity. Let's make it all about me. Let me make up the standard. And guess what? It wasn't hard to find those justices, was it? It wasn't hard to find those lawyers wearing robes and say, we are going to create this new liberty of personal autonomy, personal identity, and instead of it being unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct that the government can regulate, what do we know about liberty? Now it's liberty. Now liberty stops government from using its power. So now if I want to engage in a partial birth abortion, no longer is it unhealthy, dangerous conduct. Now it's my personal identity, personal autonomy, liberty, and that's going to stop the government from coming after, from letting me not exercise that freedom. Now, if the government wanted to do so, it could have amended the Constitution to add liberty or change the Constitution. We have a provision in the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment, that Article 5, that allows for that. But again, they didn't have the support of the votes to do that, so that's why they bypassed the way to change the Constitution and say, let's just add a liberty right next to let's just call personal autonomy and personal liberty. It's going to have the same rank, it's going to have the same dignity as the First Amendment right of religious speech, right of conscience, right of due process. We're going to put it right up there with all those major fundamental and inalienable rights, so that if the government tries to interfere with your right of personal identity and autonomy, they're going to get struck down. Do you see what the court inevitably did, though? Now they've got a right of free speech and religious conscience over here that's actually in the Constitution, and they've added, through their opinions, this new fundamental right of personal autonomy and personal identity, and they are obviously on a collision course with themselves, aren't they? Because if your pastor says to two men who come in one day and say, I see that you marry people, I would like you to marry me, and engage in a worship service to solemnize that marriage. And we have a constitutional right, and we have laws that require you to do that. And you say, well, wait a minute, the government can't use those laws to force me to do that because I have a fundamental right of religious conscience. Now you've got two rights that are on a collision course with themselves. And as I mentioned to you just briefly, the United States government has now taken the official position which one has to bend the knee to the other. If you are a pastor, or if you are a leader of a denomination, that should concern you. Now, in the end, I don't want you to forget who we serve. We serve a living God who is sitting on the throne. And we should act that way. And we should act without fear, and we should be like Joshua, strong and courageous. But that doesn't mean that we ignore the realities. And so I challenge you to pick up the pamphlets that he was talking about, or go to our website at the Great Lakes Justice Center. We have, especially for Michigan and for other places, gone through and provided guidance to churches on what you can do to make sure that your facility use policy and your statement of faith and all these things that should come second nature, but we haven't thought about because we haven't been threatened by the secular government, that we need to start thinking about. Now, are these ideas that are in there, and they're very good ones, by the way, written by very, very good lawyers, going to completely inoculate you against government coming after your church someday, probably not. But you know what it will do? It's kind of like the predator and prey. The prey that is smart, sometimes God creates a prey and they can make themselves look really big, and it kind of scares the predator away. Well, that's kind of what some of these things are that we've put together for you, and what this guidance is when the ACLU or some of these other organizations start targeting, and they are targeting Christian organizations. We are representing businesses that have been specifically targeted because of their religious Christian faith. When they come to target you, if you're one of the ones that have all these protections in there, that's going to make it a lot more difficult for them to come after. They're probably going to go on and find somebody that's not as quite protected. That's worth doing. All right, so we've got the court now that has used its power to create a new constitutional right not written anywhere in the Constitution, but treating it the same as all of these things. And the unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct of abortion is now considered a constitutional right because I have a personal autonomy and I have a personal identity, liberty to engage in abortion. Well, the next case was a partial birth abortion case where the government was trying to stop the unhealthy, dangerous, and immoral conduct of partial birth abortion. Court said, nope, we've already created this new liberty of personal identity and personal autonomy, and the way you drafted this statute, it's interfering with that personal right, so that attempt to protect that unborn son or daughter, actually that partially born son or daughter in that particular case, struck down. Government, get away, you're interfering with this new liberty we've created. Next case involved engaging in homosexual conduct. The dangerous and unhealthy and unsafe conduct that has killed many, many people, including people that I have been personally very close to. And government was regulating it. Supreme Court again says, nope, that's just like the other things you're interfering with. It's all about me, personal autonomy right now, again, my personal liberty right. You cannot regulate that anymore, even though people are dying. And it didn't take long for those of us whose job it was to study the Constitution to know where that was going. At that point, we knew same-sex marriage was inevitable because, again, it's all part of my personal identity. It's all part of my personal autonomy. And it therefore did not surprise us at all. It didn't surprise us at all. That the next thing that was being argued is that men should be allowed to say they feel like a girl and go into your locker room. What can we do? How can we respond? All those ideas that were given earlier, write them down, do them, get those letters going. The additional things that we can do, and I'm going to finish up here, is that Congress has a whole lot of other powers under the Constitution that they can use to undermine and return the Supreme Court to a court that will act under the rule of law as opposed to like an imperial judiciary. Congress has the power to strip jurisdiction of the court in these areas. All it has to do is stand up and say you can't do this anymore, and under the Constitution they can't. Congress has the power of the purse, which means not only do they have the power to tax you, they have the power to expend the money, and they spend many dollars every year going to the Supreme Court. And so the Supreme Court could wake up tomorrow and say, hey, I don't have any law clerks, I don't have a library, I don't have ink in my pen, the only thing I have left is my salary because the Constitution says they can't touch that. And obviously the House of Representatives has the power to impeach a justice, and the Senate has the power to remove a justice after impeachment. Those justices, like myself, when I was a federal judge, I had to put my hand on the Holy Bible and put my other hand toward heaven and swear I would uphold the Constitution against all enemies, foreign, domestic, so help me God. These justices took that same oath and have ignored it. You know who else takes that oath? The governor of every state, the attorney general of every state. And so what if a governor of a state or the attorney general of a state, the chief law enforcement officer, stood up and said, you know what, justices, just because you abrogated your oath of office as to the constitutional rule of law of this nation, we can't do so. So we as a governor or an attorney general refuse to follow that unconstitutional and illegitimate decision. And the rule of law in Michigan, for example, is the Constitution of the state of Michigan amended by the people to state that marriage is exactly what it actually means. If just one governor would do that, if just one governor would have the courage to do that, I predict that there would be a domino effect. And there would be many more very quickly. And it would be a shot across the bow against an out-of-control, and I say this with all much respect, imperial judiciary that is operating outside the rule of law and is directly threatening your church and your business and your way of life. Now, get up. I leave you with a positive to pray, stay in the Word every day. These are not our opponents. They may be our opponents. They may be attacking us, and they will attack you viciously if you engage in these conversations. But you know what? I'm going to leave you with this. They're also our mission field. And anger, which we have, the Bible says when that sun comes, that anger needs to go away, because anger does not get us to righteousness here. So we need to diminish anger. We must not ever diminish truth in our endeavor, but let's reach out. Let's continue without diminishing truth, but by diminishing our anger, speak truth in love, and let's stand up for a living Lord and Savior and know that He is alive, and let's start acting that way. And I believe that the greatest days of this nation are yet to come. So God bless you all, and thank you for having me.